Please help yourself to the cookies, lemonade, and the water over here. At any time in the meeting, just get up and go. And the restrooms are out through that door. Anything else I need to let them know? I think so.
So tonight we're going to present some history of the Jack and Jill or Double J Ranch, depending how old you are. And after the meeting, there are lots of pictures up there on the bar, history, and some of the books have some brochures that we're sent out to people who might come here as guests. We looked at one of the books the other day, and one of the brochures said they printed 15,000 of those brochures to be sent out. So it was a big deal, and we'll get into some notes in a minute, but one of the things that you'll see is that they reached people from Alabama, from Nebraska, and from other places of the United States to come here as a dude ranch, if you want to call it that. So again, what we're going to do is we're going to try and present things in the 10-year period, starting with 1930. And then after we get through 1930, we'll ask you if you have any comments. I'm going to do some presenting, Barb's going to do some presenting. We'll ask you if you have any comments, and if there's none, then we're going to go to the 1940s and so on. So we'll go as quickly as we can. All right? Barb is going to correct this name in a few minutes. S-T-O-U-C-H, and she'll tell you why that changed in a few minutes. But George and Mary Stouch, I believe is how I'm going to pronounce it, there was some controversy whether they were born in Germany or whether they lived in Chicago. But they left Germany, according to my notes, in 1914, and they came here and they bought 80 acres of land. It included a brick house that the Kennedys had built in 1894. Inside this land was a large spring, which is still there. It's big walleye cat. In 1930, their daughter Roma wanted to know what to do with this, so she thought maybe she could take some high school girls or some girls and use this lake, use of the surrounding woods, and have a private school for some girls. And she would be the counselor. There would be ages from 8 to 12, and they would camp, they would do crafts, they would do swimming, they would do dramas, dancing, and all kinds of other sports, including horseback riding. In those days, it was because of all the trees around here, it was called Cedar Shores because of the hundreds of white cedar trees that were in the area. If you go out here, this was Water Street, or still is Water Street out here. If you go up to Clay Road, from my notes, it says that there is a bronze plaque marking that area. In the 1930s, there was a depression, and so the camp kind of fell apart. But they still owned the land, so what they decided they would do is they would try and have local church congregations come out here, and they would have counselors for the summer for vacation for different churches. At that time, instead of it being called Cedar Shores, it was changed to Jack and Jill Ranch. And in the mid-70s, we'll talk about some different changes. In the mid-70s, they decided to change the name again to Double J Ranch Resort. And in 2009, they changed it just to Double J Resort. George, his other name is?
Strock.
Or he might have changed his name to George Storm.
He did. I think he did. He took his mother's maiden name was Storms, and so it was probably difficult to pronounce their last name, so they just chose Storms.
He was a teacher in the University of Miami, and he taught speech, public speaking, and he was also a head counselor down there. He decided that this would be a great vacation place, and he wanted to reach the kids, the people from 18 to 35. And at one time, it was even called Jack and Jill Colony Camp before it was called Jack and Jill Ranch. He bought up some neighboring farms and he extended the marketing. And according to the census in 1920 and 1930, he lived in Grant Township in Oceana County, which is where we're at right now. But in 1955, from what we can find out, he moved back to Chicago. He died in 1952 in Florida, and his wife died in 1962. So that's my notes on 1930. Anything you want to add?
Try to catch up to you.
While she's looking, does anybody else remember those years? No, okay.
Well, there's an audio of Rex, what was his last name, who used to play in a band up here.
King family?
Yeah, Rex King, was that it? The first year I was part of the Historical Society in 2010, he gave a talk with several other seniors, including Blanche Mason. And he talked about coming up here and meeting girls from around the area.
I'll talk a little bit more about what she was talking about. When we came in, somebody asked me if there was a map of this area. I do have one that's kind of a current map, and if somebody'd like to, well, we'll just put it up here, and we'll put it up there on the bar afterwards. We could pass it around, yeah. Somebody want to grab this? We can just pass it around.
Jack and Jill Ranch welcomed its first guests in 1937. George K. Stearns, with his staff of 65 wranglers and 65 horses, could accommodate 175 people. The special feature was a steak dinner grilled by the wranglers. The ranch also hosted a greased pig chase, a spinning contest, a wood chopping contest for the men, and a roller pin throwing contest for the women.
Do they throw it at their husbands?
I don't know.
Remember what you just said, Bruce. Remember, this was attractive to ages 19 to 35, so no old people could come here. But for the most part, it was single people. So they didn't throw it at their husbands.
We would drive through here in the 50s. I lived in Hart, elementary age, and we'd see the sign and we'd get all eager to ask our parents to go to the dune range. They said, no, that's for grown-ups only.
And if you get Bruce's drift, grown-ups, never mind. 1930, anybody else? Let's move to the 1940s. And Barbara has already said a few things about 1940s. In the 1940s, there was about 65 wranglers and 65 horses here. And it could accommodate about 175 people. They had different things, like Barb mentioned, greased pig races. They had wood chopping for men, and they had pin throwing, roller pin throwing for the women. At that time, this was the only kind of dude ranch, if you want to call it that catered to young men and women. And they didn't take any of the rocking chair guests, as like we just said. Every minute was planned for them. And they could do overnight canoe trips. They could do backpack horse riding to Lake Michigan. And we'll talk about that when we get up to the 1960s and 70s. They had archery range, they had a rifle range, they had tennis and swimming in the lake. They had dances and stunt nights, they had ping pong, and many other kind of activities. And again, I mentioned before, some of their brochures drew people as far south as Alabama, as far west as Nebraska, and as far east as New York and New Jersey. And at that time, one of the notes that I have said that they could have 110 guests, and they had 40 employees, so there's a little bit of discrepancy in there. it was a dude ranch. And if you think about a dude ranch, some other things kind of sprung up in the area. And if I say Rainbow Ranch, that was another thing that was in the area, but that was not necessarily a dude ranch. That'd be a place where you could just, you wouldn't vacation there, you'd go and ride horses. There were other dude ranches in the area which had the same kind of thing, square dances, hoedowns, hay rides, cookouts. But this was the one that was kind of particular to this area, in particular to those kind of things. There was also working ranches where you would pay a fee to go be a cowboy for a week or whatever. And then you would be socializing and doing the daily chores of a cowboy, especially cleaning out the stalls and so on. The term city fellow was those guests from the city, and the term dudette was the female guest. Anything else from 1940?
1955. Skip. 1955 is mine.
Okay,
Next.
let's go right to 19.
I thought I read in your notes that at that time when it was built as the only dude ranch in the country.
Yes, at that time. Okay. Any other comments about 1940? Go ahead.
Well, I think my dad talked about he, when he was in his early 20s, coming up here on Friday nights because they recruit the men, local men, to come up and dance with the women at the dances because there weren't enough men guests. So that was one of the social events for the local boys.
Yeah, we'll talk about that a little bit more when we get into the 1960s and 70s.
I'd like to say something about the 40s. I just want to pay tribute to somebody who's instrumental in creating this place. His name was Vic Cedarstaff. There was a building out there on the old property called the Cedarstaff Building, and Vic was born in '05, and he helped build the wagon wheel. He invented the bolo tie, the state garment of Arizona. He had a trailer right here with his wife Maribel. They would winter in Wickenburg and spend their summers here. Vic was a wrangler here in the 40s, and he invented the bolo tie. He had a machine that wove together 7 strands of leather for these bolo ties. Barry Goldwater, Roy Rogers, all sorts of various, John Wayne, various Western characters bought Vic Cedarstaff bolo ties. And there was an exhibition of them in Phoenix just a couple years ago at the Phoenix Museum, Phoenix, Arizona. But Vic's ashes are spread on the property. And Maribel, his wife, a bit younger than him, they had a great marriage for a long time, and he died in the early 80s, as did she. But he helped build the place in the 40s.
Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Stu Scholl. This is my son Tristan, and the two of us wouldn't be here if this place wasn't here. Because my parents met at this right after World War II. My dad was working here. He was really into horses. There's a massive picture over there of him on King, his horse, and my mother fell in love with King. And Dad would be one of the people that would lead these, there was a whole day trip out to Lake Michigan where they'd have the steak fries, and then they'd ride the horses back. Now when you think about then, just the trails, and there wasn't much in terms of trespassing because there weren't a lot of people here that would worry about you going across their property. And if there was, I'm sure they had permission or asked for it afterwards. But the big thing is, they met, and he took her out on a Lucky Lake one night, rowing. The mom's in the bow, and he's rowing along, and all of a sudden, he reaches over and grabs something in the water, and bam, inside the boat. Just scared the crap out of her. She's from Chicago, you know, she came up with her 3 girlfriends, and it was a bullfrog. My dad was also a chef. He was a chef, a cook on a destroyer in World War II, so he cooked here also. He always wanted to be near food, so he wouldn't big thing was that, you know, I thought, how did you impress this Chicago woman banging bullfrogs? But he got 5, 6, 7, 8 of them, and they went in at midnight and had frog legs. He put frog legs. Yeah, a lot of cool stuff happened in there. But, all right, when you ready, see you later.
Very good. As Stu had mentioned, and it'll be coming up again when we talk about 1960s and 70s, if you look at Clay Road, which is out here on the end, that went all the way through. There was not expressway in those days. And so one of the activities they would do is they would take horseback riding, like Stu said, and they would go all the way out to Lake Michigan, and they would have a steak fry. And in the south end of Camp Claybanks, or the Claybanks Park, I should say, was a place where they would tie up their horses. Okay. 1950s, we don't have a lot of notes, but 1950s, all the activities that were talked about were still going on. One of the big things that happened in 1950s was one person got hurt and they had a lawsuit about it. It had to go to court because of his lost wages and so on. I don't know what you have for 1950.
In 1955, Wally Wojak purchased 2,300 acres horse ranch that he had been closely involved with since arriving as a guest in 1950. I think you're talking about this. Wojak and a group of Rothbury area locals planted a barren hayfield with 6-inch white pine seedlings furnished by the state of Michigan, creating a small forest of now over 70-foot tall pines called Sherwood Forest. This is where the electric forest is held every year. Wally was considered the local historian, storyteller, and mentor for many of the ranch hands and employees, and his passion for nature and people helped to build a lasting memory for all the guests. He lived and actively worked at the ranch he loved until his passing. Walter J. Wojak was born in Cleveland, Ohio in November of 1927. He died in Altman Hospital in Canton in April of 2017 at the age of 89. He had 2 sons, and his wife had died on November 12th. In honor and memory of Wally Wojak, and the Double J Resort holds an annual Wally Wojak Memorial Rodeo the Saturday of Labor Day weekend each year. The rodeo athletes from across the nation congregate on the 3,000-seat rodeo arena in bull riding, barrel racing, team roping, and all classic rodeo stunts for a weekend the whole family can enjoy.
So Barb mentioned 1952. In 1958, where we talked about George Storm. He sold the property to Seth and Jean Winslow. I believe, from what I understand, they lived in Whitehall and they owned the property. And so then we're going to get anything else in 1950s? I think we're going to 1960. Any comments out there, 1950?
Well, 1950s, wasn't that when Camp Claybanks was in existence and this was a regular location?
Yes.
For our camp?
Yep. But the township park is north of there about a mile, and that's where they would go have their steak fries. Good comment. Any others about 1950?
Yes. I had a comment. With somebody who would come up here during the 1950s, and you'd go to the hall, which the big wagon wheel window where the dances were.
Okay. Stu, you had something?
Yeah, I know my dad was talking about, probably in the late 40s, early 50s, they put in a tennis court. That was quite an ordeal, a lot of concrete. And I went to, I think, the second electric forest or whatever was called back then. I remember walking across, that cement is still there, and I'm just thinking, Dad helped make this, like 60 years ago, whatever. So that old tennis court, and that was a sport for the elite, and they came up here from Chicago, and they just had that. Yes, Margo.
Can I ask you a little bit more about your parents' meeting? Your dad was coming from down in Montague, right?
Yeah.
And your mom, where was she?
She was from Riverside, Brookfield, graduated in 44. She was a cheerleader, she played tennis, and she actually worked here in the summer then.
Oh.
For, next, I don't know how many
So they had lots of time to get acquainted.
I guess so, yeah. Yeah, she was going to be an airline stewardess. She trained for that, and then met my dad.
So if nothing else, we'll move on to 1960. Again, most of those things that we talked about were still here. I actually worked here one summer in 1960, and if you are coming up the expressway during the Electric Forest, you'll see the first field, you'll see the second field. My job was to plant that field to alfalfa, the whole field. If I was not doing that, my job was to go around and take the garbage out behind down Clay Road to the dump that they had behind there. I did get in trouble one day because, remember this was 19 to 35, and I believe they came in on Saturday and they left on Friday. Back in those days, it's not there anymore, but there was a dining hall that's up across from the rodeo place, if you want to call it, on this side of the road. And the guests would eat in the front, and the employees got to eat in the back. Well, my job again was to work out there in the field, so I brought the tractor up close. Fridays was the day for them to sing sad songs to make them cry and everything else. And they were just about ready to cry, and then the tractor started up. I learned that I should not park that close. In 1960s, it was already mentioned, what they did was they had ads put in the paper for local men to come up, and I guess you'd say men or young boys would come up. They had strict dress codes. They would come up for Thursday night or to Friday night. On Thursday night, the dress code was a tie and so on. On Friday night, it was more casual, but there were lots of rules that they could do. You couldn't go outside, you couldn't take the women outside or do anything like that. You got to remember what kind of housing and what these people were here for. It was like a bunkhouse that they stayed in. And so I think one of the pictures that maybe see up there, you had like 8 bunks in a different place, in a room. So there was no phones, no TVs, no locks in the doors. Same kind of activities that we've already mentioned. And as Stu mentioned, the tennis court was out there. Beside the tennis court on the north side was an archery range. There was also I'm going to call it a rifle range. It was actually single shot 22. Nobody knows that I have one of those in my closet.
We do now.
But you don't know which closet.
There was an unusual thing that happened to the guest. Some of them were dunked before they left. They were dunked in the Wildcat Lake, or Lake Wildcat. Other ones were dunked in a horse trough. And I should sit back up. Greg is recording all this, and we'll be putting it on YouTube of all this with a lot of pictures. And one of the notes that he might put in there is a group of 6 or 8 women came up here for a vacation. And before they left, they made sure that everyone was dunked in the lake or in the horse trough. And this one that was dunked in the horse trough, it was about an hour before she had to leave. So I think she went home in wet clothes. Barb already mentioned Wally Wajak. And again, we already mentioned that in 1958, the property was sold to Seth and Jean Winslow. And I should have mentioned this back in the couple centuries before, 10 years before. And you'll see it in some of the brochures. The typical cost for a weekend back in those days was $44.
With everything.
Is that it right there? In 1960, the cost was $60 per week. Some other things that they did was turtle races, and again, horseback riding, and I think that's all my notes for 1960.
How about 1975? You got something for 1970?
Yeah. Anybody else remember 1960? Okay. 1970. Things continued the same way they were, and if you look in the Observer or the local paper, those days it even looked like the ranch sponsored some of the local teams or bowling teams or teams in the area. This is where you come in, 1970.
Yeah, later in that decade, yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
You want to talk?
Well, I worked at the ranch for 3 summers during the 1970s. The owners were Paul and Bobby Warsicki, and he had some co-owners too, a guy named Tuna and a guy named Ray. And Paul and Bobby raised their 2 daughters here, and I think Paul and Bobby's first year running it was about 1974 or 5, and my understanding, well, he was about 34. And I was 20, so yeah. So he had the place until the late 80s, and he became a tax collector and a Republican politician in Florida. He lives in the Villages, Florida now. He and Bobby do. Anyway, but yeah, I worked here in the 70s, and it was quite a throwback. For the week, it'd have maybe anywhere from 12 to maybe 50 guests. And then on the weekends, there'd be the weekend crowd coming up from Chicago and Cleveland and Detroit to, it was more of a party atmosphere, and it was more crowded. But I worked here in 76, 78, and 79, and it was somewhat of a throwback. And what I mean by that was there were 2 payphones on the property. There was no locks on the door, no TV. You didn't drive your vehicle on the property, of course. There was no alcohol that you could purchase on the property, although you were welcome to bring that to events. It was very, very much the Dude Ranch thing. It was like a summer camp for adults. And it catered to the weekly guests. And I think the business model changed later because not too many people were spending a whole week in one place as much anymore. And then people wanted also to bring their kids with. And so the 18 to 35 thing started becoming perhaps anachronistic or not appealing widely. But yeah, in the 70s, it was still very much keeping some of the traditions from the 40s and 50s, for better and worse, and from my point of view. And it was a time of, for me anyway, it was a time of meeting some really important people in my life. And folks met and got married, like Stu's parents. There were guests that wept on Saturday when they had to drive back to Chicago. Not that I blame them, I guess. There were folks that came year after year after year after year, and then as the place changed and became more family-friendly, kid-friendly, water park, RVs, condos, those people, I think for the most part, drifted away because the ranch as it existed no longer exists. That place is gone. There's some buildings that remain, but the experience, the business model, the ambiance, the spirit, that's gone. It changed to a golf course and a water park. But the 70s was still a throwback, and people were, like I was 20, and people in their 50s and 60s were coming up, and to relive their time here in the 40s. And Hugh O'Brien, the actor, worked here. Biff Rose, the songwriter, had worked here. He had songs recorded by David Bowie, John Denver, all kinds of folks. My friend Pine worked here for many years, from the 50s into the 2000s. He just died a couple years ago at the age of 85. But he was in Nevada Smith and Rio Diablo. He was in the Alamo with John Wayne. He performed with Tex Ritter, Jim and Jesse, Willie Nelson, Waylon Jennings. He's part of the Second City Comedy Troupe. He was a character here for decades. But the 70s, my main point, the 70s, the revolution and the changes of the 60s may have happened in the general world, but there was still an element of the 30s and 40s Dude Ranch happening here in the 70s.
Could you say something about the music at the time? And I know you're in music now, but did that affect you and bring you in, or?
Yeah, well, she was asking about the music. Let's see. On Friday nights was the rodeo, and then then an after rodeo show with some music. On Saturday nights was a dance, sometimes a band from out of town. But then Paul and Bobby went to have a ranch band, so musicians, sometimes me, but many times other people formed a band. Sunday night was a staff show. Monday night was the hayride with the sing-along. Tuesday night was some kind of skit night. Wednesday night was the formal dress-up dance. So Thursday night might have been a play or something like that, and then coming back around to the Friday, and had one day off a week. But the music was varied in my time. I don't know how it went later, but you had Pine, dear old Pine, born in the 30s, a country singer. His dad was a rodeo rider, a bodyguard for George Raft and Mae West, a hobo. And Pine had this wild life. I mean, he was only 41 at the time. To me, he was like Abraham Lincoln or something. It was like, I was just so enamored of him. He had been in Hollywood movies. He had been in Gunsmoke. He knew James Arness. He played on his stories were just. I still have some of his letters. They still just like arouse a big. I'm so fortunate to have known him. Yeah, really, a real character. But he did anything. He did hobo songs, prison songs, mining songs, railroad songs, old Western songs. He could do 5 sets of Irish songs on St. Patrick's Day. He knew French Cajun songs because he grew up in Louisiana. He had this repertoire of thousands of songs. The first time I met him, I had my song list, of my John Denver and Gordon Lightfoot and my things that I knew at the time in the 70s. And I looked at his list and I said, oh, wow, that's your list, here's my list. But I was just looking at his Hank Snow song list. His Hank Snow song list was more than all the songs I knew ever. Like, this guy's repertoire was vast, hundreds, thousands of songs. And so there was that tradition there. But then there was also the singer-songwriter tradition thing going on, people writing songs, singing songs, and there was some pop, country, and rock and roll of the time. And then when the high schoolers came up, in May, high school groups came up for a few days for their senior trip. And so in the 70s, there'd maybe be a country western or a disco dance for the young folks down in the wagon wheel. So I guess the short answer to your question is there was a musical variety from folk and country music, cowboy music, thanks to Pine, and then rock and roll and singer-songwriter and contemporary music. Yeah.
You said 50 and 60-year-olds would show up. Were they coming because they had been here when they were 18 to 35?
Almost exclusively, yeah. There was a long tradition of people coming back year after year after year. It was like almost like coming home, and there's a homecoming week every mid-September. There's homecoming week, and people would come back. Sometimes the people that showed up on the first week of the year, when things weren't quite together, still painting, still sweeping, still getting things going, they'd come back for homecoming week. And that was an 8-day week. And a lot of old-timers, we call them, getting back together. But yeah, it was a second home to a lot of them. And they had these booklets that they signed. There's songs that everybody had in common. Going down an old dusty road, Mr. Moon, Marching to Pretoria. There's all these songs that everybody knew. Everybody sang together at lunchtime, after dinner. There's one meal served at lunch and one at dinner with no menu. Everybody eats the same thing at the same time, and then followed up by announcements and sing-alongs. It was very cohesive, or tried to be, and forming solidarity. Such that if you were here all week, when the weekenders showed up on Friday night, you felt like there was this invasion. There are folks showing up that are maybe drinking more heavily, perhaps, and here for just a weekend for fun and to dance or whatever. But if you're here all week, we used to see, like, you get them at the hayride. That's where we got them. because that's where Pine delivered the poem, "Do not think you people sit alone here among the dead breeze and hollow branches." The poem, if you've ever heard, "The Campfire Speaks Tonight," that's the poem. But there'd be a joke-telling contest, sing along, and the poem, and by the end of the night, you had it. That was like, okay, we got it now, you know, for the week. We're trying to get this family here for the week, yeah. And then they cried when they left. Yeah.
So we're going to combine 1980s and 1990s, and in fact, it's kind of going to go into up to the present as we get ready to go through the rest of the history. In 1987, Bob, L-I-P-S, Lipsitz. Okay. He was in Detroit, and along with the mention of Wally Waljak that Barb already mentioned, they took the partnership and they were working on this ranch. And in 1992, they had about $1 million invested. And then they also added at that time the golf course up north, and we'll see later that they'll add Grandview, I believe that's the name of it, the other golf course that's kind of east of or west of there. They also added some other things, some water parks, and they also got a grant from the state for $600,000. Anything else on 1980 or 90? Okay. I think one of the other things, and I asked you when you came in if you wanted to, second Stu, one of the other things they did in the 1998 is they added this back 40. That was not here at that time. And then later they'll add the campground. Go ahead, Stu.
What was the grant for? To build something? Or?
It says received the first state tourism grant.
Okay.
Okay?
I have a question.
Yes.
They were talking about the campers sleeping in bunks and stuff. So when they came back, there's hotels here now, right? Are there hotels on this property?
Yes.
So when they came, these 50 and 60-year-olds, when they came back, did they have a different sleeping arrangements, or were they still going to these same bunk houses?
Well, the ranch that Joan and Bob Lipsitz, I mean, that's a whole new era, but the 40s and the 50s, the 60s and the 70s, into the mid-80s, when I think Paul and Bobby sold the place like in '88, people came back to the original ranch property.
Okay.
So that bunkhouse is gone, the chuck wagon is gone, Calico Town is gone, the Cedar Staff building is gone, the tower is gone. So the hitching post is there, and a couple of the other buildings, I think it's no trespassing. I tried to visit the property down there, and somebody showed up in a four-wheeler asking me as if I was like invading a nuclear waste area or something like that. It was, I don't blame it, I understand. Can't have people wandering around. But yeah, people stayed on the original ranch property, and everything around us here was forest and trail rides.
So what do they have here now so far as people staying overnight? Like where are their hotels located? Somewhere?
Campground.
There's a campground right back here.
And they got the condos there by the golf course.
Condos?
Yes.
Oh.
If you go up there by the Thoroughbred Golf Course, there's condos up there, yeah. And I believe hotels where they could stay overnight.
And there's cabins back here. Yeah. The RV park, cabins.
Okay. So we're going to kind of jump into the present time things. Go ahead.
Can I say something? The only time that I ever came up here was because my nephew was working here. And it was around 1999 or 2000. And he was an entertainer. He has a beautiful voice, and he does some dance training too. And we were a little bit appalled because his job was to sing and flirt with the ladies in the audience. And we hadn't seen him, I mean, he was just 18 or 19, we hadn't seen him in that role before, but he was getting a kick out of it. I mean, most of the audience was older at the time. But it had a very different flavor than what you were talking about, for sure.
So we're going to jump into the 2000s, and if you remember, or if you even come up here during the last part of June, you'll see the electric forest, at least the people up there. The name has changed to Double JJ, and in the 2008, I think that it was the first year of the electric forest. There was some questions of the ownership of the ranch. There was some questions whether it was going to be sold. There was some questions about bankruptcy. And because of that, they didn't know if there would be another electric forest. And I believe that there is going to be a Progressive Resort LLC stepped forward and bought the property, or at least took it over, so that the electric forest would continue. If you look at present day, there are more than 1,000 acres of ranch property. It includes 3 big lakes. It includes the golf course that we already talked about, the Thoroughbred, and I believe Grandview. Am I getting the name right? The other golf course that's here. And it includes several restaurants, and I believe at the present time, because it's kind of off-season, there's maybe only 2 of them that are still open. And I don't know, when we talked to them before, they were going to try and put some menus up there. I don't know if they did that. They're on the tables? Okay, all right. So you're welcome to look at that. The Thoroughbred Golf Course, if I say Arthur Hills, does that mean anything to golfers? Anyhow, he designed it. And some other changes, some hospitality group came in and took care of it, and took over, kind of overseeing everything. I think that's most of my notes. You got anything else? You don't have anything else? As you can see from going through here, electric forest, if you were to go out in the camp in here, there is some kind of, I'm going to call it some kind of, if I went out in the woods and I built a place where I would deer hunt from, it would almost look like that. But from what I understand, during the electric forest, it is all lit up with all kinds of things out there. During the electric forest, it's not unusual to see 45 to 50,000 people here. And I believe that is most of my notes.
It takes 6 weeks to set up for the electric forest. 6 weeks. They employ a lot of young people, too, I think, from the area.
So if anybody else have any kind of comments?
We had dinner tonight before we came here up above the golf course, and they told us that they shut down for 1 whole week because it's impossible for their guests to get in or out. Everything else is so crowded from the forest activity that they simply gave up on having the restaurant open or the golf courses. So they lose, in other words, a week's worth of revenue each time the forest happens.
People come from all over the country to electric forests.
They come from Alaska.
It's amazing. But we know some locals who live north of here, some ladies more or less my age, who think it's just terrible because all of this influx of people are not like us, and they'll teach our young people to get into drugs and things like that. So there is a little conflict there, and I think the noise for the locals is a little much.
Doesn't Rothbury make some kind of money from the ticket sales?
A lot of money.
Yeah, so that helps the town.
It's really family oriented. A lot of the women, have their kids, and it is so cool. The artwork is just incredible. It's just so worth going. I think everybody should be able to go have an opportunity to go there just once. It's really good. During the day.
So I'm just going to ask, if you've been to electric forest, would you raise your hand? All right, so we're going to break in a minute. But you just saw those hands go up. Some people were bus drivers, some people have actually been here and did whatever on the ground. Ask them some questions. So Barb and I would like to thank you for coming. There are several books up there that are history books, or at least got a lot of pictures. There's old brochures up there. You're feel free to look at those books. There's cookies, there's lemonade up there, and water, and there's some more pictures on that end. And again, Greg has recorded most of this, and it'll take him whatever Greg's speed is to put it up on YouTube. And we have collected a lot of pictures that he'll put in there with those, along with us talking where we've been stumbling and so on. Go ahead.
One thing I did find is, in 2023, the village of Rothbury received over $300,000 from the Electric Forest Festival, which goes toward village enhancements. In April 2024, the Village of Rothbury Council voted to change the number of festival attendees from 50,000 to 70,000.
And so, what Barb has just mentioned, and some of you mentioned, that the Village of Rothbury received some money. After the guests leave for Electric Forest, some of the school people would come and they would help clean up and get paid for that. And I don't know if they still do it, but at one time they would take the leftover tents and leftover things and have like a garage sale. We actually went to a garage sale in Montague, a church garage sale in Montague a couple months ago, and they had 2 or 3 boxes of hammers. They had 2 or 3 big baggies full of scissors. There's probably 10 or 15 scissors in each. Things that were collected after guests left here. So again, thank you for coming. There's pictures up there, there's cookies up there, there's lemonade and water. And I believe, Chris, if you have any other questions, he'd be... Oh, sorry.
I don't know anything.
You don't know anything? He worked here during the summer, and he would be glad to answer some of your other questions.
Denise wanted to talk a little bit about one of the special events that they featured here.
Oh, when they had at Halloween, they used to have their haunted barn. And I'm so sad that they don't do that anymore, because that was great. But now I think with the way society is now, it wasn't quite okay to come after us with chainsaws. So they did. And I have to tell you, when we went to the Electric Forest, it was great. Okay, we might not have quite fit in. But I told the young people, I said, yeah, this is nice, but it's still not quite Woodstock.
So again, I don't know what time it is. We have this room till about 9 o'clock.
7:58.
So we have about an hour before we have to leave. So thank you.